Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Megan Hoyer. I'm the Director of Public Programs and Public Engagement here at the Whitney Museum of American Art. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's program, Making Jasper Johns' Mind Mirror. Thank you all so much for joining us. This program is organized in conjunction with the exhibition, Jasper Johns' Mind Mirror, an unprecedented look at Jasper Johns' extraordinary, almost 7-decade career, as well as a unique collaboration between the Whitney and the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It is a retrospective of a single artist on view simultaneously at both museums. For this conversation, we are fortunate to have the co-curators of Jasper Johns' Mind Mirror, Scott Rothkopf from the Whitney and Carlos Basualdo from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, to illuminate the curatorial process behind the exhibition and to speak together about new perspectives on Johns' work that it offers and invites. They are joined by Ann Temkin, a curator and scholar who brings her own deep engagement with Johns' work to the discussion and will serve as our moderator tonight. I'm going to briefly introduce each of our speakers. Carlos Basualdo is the Keith L. and Katherine Sachs Senior Curator of Contemporary Art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where he has organized exhibitions, including a survey of the work of Michelangelo Pistoletto in 2010, and with Erica Battle, Dancing Around the Bride, Cage, Cunningham, Johns, Rauschenberg, and Duchamp in 2012. He was the lead organizer of Bruce Nauman Topological Gardens that represented the USA in the 2007 Venice Biennale and was awarded the Golden Lion for Best National Participation. Scott Rothkopf is Senior Deputy Director and Nancy and Steve Crown Family Chief Curator at the Whitney Museum of American Art. He joined the Whitney in 2009 as a curator, and in that role has organized numerous exhibitions, including Glenn Ligon America in 2011, Jeff Koons, a retrospective in 2014, and Laura Owens in 2017. And Ann Temkin is the Marie-Josée and Henry Kravis Chief Curator of Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art, where she has organized exhibitions including Judd in 2020, Picasso Sculpture in 2015, Robert Gober, The Heart is Not a Metaphor, and Jasper Johns' Regrets, both in 2014, among many others. Prior to joining MoMA in 2003, Temkin was the Muriel and Philip Berman Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I want to remind everyone that closed captioning is available for this program and can be accessed through the button on the bottom of your screen. We've also reserved time at the end of the program to take some questions from you, our audience. Please submit your questions using the Q&A function, and we will share them with the speakers. And finally, before I turn the conversation over to this esteemed group, I want to say a warm welcome to the family of Marianne L. Flack, a longtime Whitney docent. I'm delighted that we are joined tonight by Marianne's daughters, Stephanie and Jennifer, her beloved grandchildren, Emma and Jack, and many of her friends and colleagues from over the years. When she passed away, Marianne's husband, Peter Flack, made a generous gift in her memory to the Whitney in support of our public programs. I'm so grateful to the entire Flack family for this wonderful gesture in honor of Marianne and her curiosity and intellectual spirit and her more than 25 years of service to the Whitney. Thank you all again so much for joining us. And now it's my pleasure to turn things over to Ann, Scott, and Carlos.
Are you going to start?
Yes. Hello, Scott. Hello.
Hi, Ann.
Carlos.
Before we start, can Carlos and I thank you for doing this? I know there were a lot of thank yous, but we're really happy to be here with you. And also thank you and all your colleagues and your trustees at MoMA for being such incredible lenders to this exhibition, because we truly could not have done it without the support of MoMA. So we're just thrilled about that and deeply appreciative.
Well, the honor and pleasure is mine, and I want to first of all congratulate you both on the exhibitions. We can talk about it in the singular or plural. And that brings me to the point I wanted to make right away, which is that we curators are very well aware over these last couple of years of the sort of surprising advantages that digital living has brought to us. And one of those is that we can be in two places at once. So one of the particular things about this show, as everybody knows, is that it's in two cities. Digitally, we can be in both cities tonight. So going on this virtual tour of Jasper Johns' Mind Mirror, we are going to bounce between Philadelphia and New York. And we're basically going to structure the evening as a quick tour, very abbreviated tour of several galleries in the exhibition as laid out by Carlos and Scott in specific sections. And for those of you who've been to the show already, this will be familiar. For those of you who haven't, I'll just review it for a moment. Carlos and Scott divided the show not as a linear walk from beginning to end of the career, but into these categories that they spent a lot of time and thought and creativity devising certain categories that would appear in the Whitney and other categories that would appear in Philadelphia, but always in a twinned relation one to another. So we're going to go through the sets of twinned sections, or a selection of them, that is, tonight. And one of the things, Carlos and Scott, that I want to talk to you about is something that I noticed when I went through the exhibition, that not only is the subject matter different one from the other as you go from section to section or museum to museum, but each section also in many ways has a different approach, one could say methodology, curatorially to what you did. So it's not like you took 10 subjects and just did them each the same way over and over again. With each new subject, it felt like, to me anyway, that you also brought a kind of new point of view for how you would do it. So tonight, as we go through these, what I'm going to be asking you about is how these gallery sections appear in each city, not only in terms of their different content, but also in terms of their different form. Sound okay?
Perfect.
All right, so we're going to start at the beginning. Why not? First galleries, first motifs. I think starting out here, I'm guessing what you all had in mind was, if anybody knows anything about Jasper Johns' work, this is probably what they know. So here we have at the Whitney, Flags and Maps. Scott?
Sure. This is actually the second gallery at the Whitney, if we
Yes.
don't talk about the entry. And I think, you know, Carlos and I knew that the first thing people would think about would be these early motifs, flags, maps, numbers, targets, alphabets, et cetera. And we sort of each start in a slightly different way and kind of get to this point, a beat into our story. And, you know, I think what these two galleries show you about the methodology that you were describing is that, you know, the tendency in a quote normal Jasper Johns show would be you'd mix all those motifs together. But we thought that if we separated a pair of motifs in New York and a single motif in Philadelphia and installed them in a certain way, each of those galleries would maybe show you something different about the material than if they were presented in the sort of ordinary grouping of quote things the mind already knows, which is that quote of Johns as to how he used these everyday motifs in his work. So, you know, I should say from the start that Carlos and I curated all these rooms together, and the 10 joining concepts as well as the different galleries in each city, and we can talk about that as we go. But I'll just start with this one because you have it on the screen, and then I know we have numbers next. You know, this was one of those galleries I think that was really in our heads from the beginning. You know, Jasper has said that he didn't have much interest in the patriotic or not patriotic associations of a symbol like a flag or a map, but it doesn't feel like a coincidence that two of those 5 most prevalent early motifs actually have something to do with the United States. And how they inform one another and kind of pressure each other was always really interesting to us. There was this idea that we could make a really stately gallery at the Whitney, almost like a kind of classical picture gallery, with the works in this case in color on the left, facing off with those in black and white on the right. And that might open onto an interesting set of associations about the country, whether it's a country that's divided, as it is and has been for a long time, whether it's a country that some people view with more promise and optimism, and others with more maybe malevolence or failure in terms of how it treats its citizens or those of other nations. And so this became, I think, a kind of key moment in the curatorial concept to see how these symbols, although they're so known to people and in Johns's work, could open onto a different kind of plane of thought.
Yeah. And then let's take the next slide and go to Philadelphia. So Carlos.
And we thought about the motifs, you know, in a way you can say that the entire show is about motifs, right? Because this sort of, you know, in the narrative of the work or some of the cemented narratives, you know, the conversation about the motifs affects mostly the early work. And then later on, you know, they are referred to these patterns or forms that appear recurrently are referred in a different manner. But I think that in the context of the project that Scott and I did together, you know, that differentiation is not operative, really. You know?
Yeah.
And if Jasper would be a musician, we would say that these are ritornellos, right? And why to focus on these ritornellos first? I think is to set the stage of the repetition, you know, and show how the repetition is truly the main component of the work, this repetition and variation. So that's what guided the curatorial choices, you know, in these two rooms. And it was clear to us also that these repetitions needed to be treated differently in relationship to the subject matter. So while maps, we wanted to, you know, we have to keep in mind that we were going to open the show a week before the presidential elections. So the flags and maps is a statement that, you know, we saw as extremely pertinent for that time. And unfortunately, you know, the more we move into these troubled times, the more pertinent it continues to be in terms of the profoundly divided nation, you know, and a profoundly divided concept of what the nation is. And in the numbers, I think Scott, you know, and I always have this idea of endless proliferation. And it is a slightly different motif than all the others, just because it started so early and Jasper is still working with it and has worked with it in so many different ways. So we wanted to create a room that gives that sense of, you know, abundance, endless proliferation, sort of an immersive room where numbers are basically coming at you from different sides.
We have one more slide of it as well, Carlos. Yeah, where so you have the black and white, but also the color of, as you say, just kind of endless return, right?
Yes, and we saw these prints for the first. I mean, we had seen these prints many times before, but we saw them together at the Modern, and when we saw them at the Modern, we both were like, absolutely, we have to have them. So
yeah,
just to reinforce what Scott said about, you know, the great adventure that was to look at these things together, and thanks to you, and thanks to your colleagues, and thanks to many colleagues and different institutions that allow us to really explore this in the way that we want.
And in a situation like this one, you can almost just go back in your mind a couple of slides and see how this giant numbers here almost can be its own map, the colored numbers actually, right? It's kind of mapping numbers anyway. So you've got that relationship across the cities.
Yeah, and you know, that painting speaks so beautifully to the map from MoMA and the sense of an image that's kind of imbricated in this hectic pictorial field. So sometimes the connections exist like that, even though the motif might be different, maybe the way of approaching it could be more similar.
Yeah.
And of course, also the contrast that you see in these two slides between black and white and color, which also happens in Philadelphia, and that's a recurring idea in Jasper's work, but it wasn't arranged in the same way because of that more hectic idea of, you know, being kind of trapped in this digital space that Carlos was describing.
Right, and that we can't get two-dimensionally. For that, you have to go to Philadelphia. All right, let's go on to another, next slide. another of your categories that was probably a super difficult thing to narrow down, you decided that you wanted to make place and differences of place, two of your sections. So then, however, having decided that, you had to pick places. So what you narrowed it down to were Japan on the one hand and South Carolina on the other. So speak to us a little bit about how you managed, why did those two win out?
You know, like flags and maps and numbers, I hate to say this, but it was not hard at all. It just came out because Japan is so, and you know Jasper very well, like Scott, and it's so clear that he has been fascinated with Japan for such a long time, and it's such an enduring fascination, and he has such fondness for everything Japanese. And so digging a little bit, of course, we found about these two. I mean, at first, you know, when he was stationed during the Korean War, but then coming back in '64, which is such an amazing trip. I mean, coming from Hawaii, you know, where he was with John Cage and Toru Takemitsu, and meeting everybody who, you know, was somebody at that time in the Japanese art world, and then staying there and making these extraordinary works there, and then going back so many times, both physically and in his mind. Yeah. And South Carolina was obvious in the sense that that's where he was born, and he spent his formative years, and some of that, you know, comes later. I mean, that speaks to the bifurcated temporality of these shows. But then, when talking about the historical moment, we focus on Edisto Beach, and that's a work that he says extraordinary work. It's in the Whitney's collection. When you see it's a door, it's almost like imprinted. He almost imprinted the door of his studio in Edisto Beach. So it's like the painting takes you in the world of, you know, his relationship with South Carolina and the beach. And the beach is, you know, he's very fond of the situation of the beach, and he has gone to, you know, he has had studios in other beaches in the past, but we felt that Edisto, in a way, summarized his strong relationship with a certain place, and of course it has a tragic end, because the studio burns. Yeah, and when the studio burns, not only some of his works are lost, some of the works of his friends are lost. So to us, it spoke about loss. And loss and desire we see as intrinsic components of the entirety of the world.
And, you know, and what I would say too about this was we looked at the places that had the kind of long tail of a sort of influence or a mark on his life and his way of thought. And so the two slides. We have
a couple of slides more, yeah.
Yeah, the two slides you've just shown focus on works made in the 60s in both Japan and South Carolina. But the interest in these places and the thinking about them continued. So you have a kind of, you know, sort of two parts to each of these galleries. Most of the galleries in the show are chronologically pretty specific, but not these galleries. They cut across decades. And now you're looking at the later side in Philadelphia at the Yusuyuki works, which are not only inspired by or related to this term that he was interested in of this lightly falling snow that came to describe this hatch pattern for him, but he also made works with incredible printmakers from Japan who were working in New York at a later date than when he was living in Japan. And they were just unbelievable at working with silkscreen. And so you see some of those prints. And then if you go to the next slide in New York, you see how his memories of his childhood came to the surface of the work in a very explicit way, thinking back on South Carolina now in the 90s, the 2000s as an older man with the floor plan or the blueprint on the left of the grandfather's house that he grew up in, which he traced from memory. Or on the right, it's a little hard to see, but there's actually a little picture of his grandparents' family. So the idea that he's thinking about a place now in retrospect across, let's say, 70 years was really interesting to us.
Yeah, so I mean, showing this again, this ritornello, but now it's not exemplified through the repeated use of a motif, but it's a sort of it happens in his mind, it happens in his imagination, going back to to a place where he had been and doing something which is very much sort of homage to that place, sort of trying to find a connection with that past.
Yeah.
And this would also be a kind of funny inside moment to share with people that hasn't really been talked about, but the way that we worked as a team was extremely close and collaborative. And we each took the lead sort of in organizing different pairs of galleries, including some of the ones you see at the Whitney, Carlos did more on and vice versa. And so actually he did a really beautiful job of creating the initial checklists, we did together, but that was like his research project for these 2 galleries. And then a point came when we had chosen the 10 that would appear in each city that we kind of gave almost as gifts to one another, those checklists. And then we had to go and edit them and add things and subtract things and make them fit in our respective spaces. But as I go through the show, I see so many of Carlos's ideas present at the Whitney. And, I'm sure it works in both ways, but it was a really kind of almost like playing a game, the 2 of us together with these works and this back and forth was really amazing.
Very much in the spirit of mind/mirror.
Exactly.
Only this time you had 2 minds. You had an advantage. But I think it comes through, and I think what comes through also, is the time in Johns's work. Obviously, the time over which these themes, like sort of almost like bobbing in the water, like sink down a little, come up. But also the time put into gathering these things and thinking through them together. Somehow that's tangible in the exhibition in a beautiful way. The next section, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, no, I just wanted to mention that the painting that could be seen in the previous slides at the back of the room, which is called Usuyuki, like the rest of the works in that gallery, has been in Japan for many, many decades. I mean, it was painted in 82, and it was shown in New York for 4 weeks. And then it went to his home at the Saison Museum. And it's the first time that it comes back to the States. So Jasper himself has not seen the painting for decades. And I think it was quite, it took a lot of courage and goodwill from many sides to make it travel here.
Okay, so that's a special moment. That's the kind of thing curators sort of dream of and aren't sure will come true, and now and then they do. We're going to go to the next slide to talk about a gallery that's unusual or actually unique in your sets of galleries, in that in both cities, it's actually the same theme, not complementary themes, which is kind of a joke on all of us because the theme is doubles and reflections. And yet, obviously, they're not the identical gallery in each museum. But talk about why in the heart of the show, you actually kind of wanted to break your own rule about 2 different sides of a coin and just give the same coin.
Yeah, I might start with that. Once we had the idea to work together on a show that would appear simultaneously in both cities, and I give Carlos credit for this, he was like, why don't we do it instead of one going to the other like a normal co-organized show at the same time? Sounded like an amazing adventure. And then we had faced this very complicated question of, well, how the heck would we organize this that would make any sense? Would you put early work over here and late work over there, or paper versus paintings? And we always felt that we didn't want that each venue should give people a kind of, integrated experience from start to end, in particular if someone wouldn't see it in both places, although we always hoped that they would. And finally, the idea kind of grew out of Jasper's work, that he had always been interested, almost since day one in his art, in this notion of mirroring, like the painting you see at the center here, Corpse and Mirror 2. It's a little tricky in the slide, but it's a painting that's bilaterally symmetrical, and it's flanked by 2 paintings that each have a double, the flag and the double map. And there's so many examples of this, a thing in black and white and in color, or something in encaustic, something in oil. And we found in his work a kind of clue to, I wouldn't say it's not the theme of the exhibition, but as Carlos put it to me the other day, it's the organizing principle of the relationship between the two sites, Philadelphia and the Whitney, that they mirror each other or echo each other or reflect each other. And we wanted then to have a gallery at each place that surfaced the kind of origin of that idea. And as you note, it's kind of funny because we articulate it through different works, but it's the only gallery where the same theme is sort of expressed at the same time. And it was really fun to play that out in the space. As you can see, Carlos did this fantastic installation of the symmetrical painting flanked by the two double paintings.
Yeah,
And at
beautiful.
some point, we even thought that the two galleries would like be, mirrors of each other. It was not possible to do it, and they're predicated, with a slightly different group of works, but both have at the center the Ale canvas, right? And
Yeah.
so at the center of the gallery of two galleries,
We can go to the next. Yeah, you see it at the Whitney, the ale cans.
Yeah, which is, for those who don't know, it's a sculpture of two almost identical beer cans, and they're an addition of two. So we in fact have almost the same work showing this double at the center of each of these galleries. It's kind of like the conceptual hinge of the show, or like the umbilical cord or something between Philadelphia and New York. And you can see
four bronze cans of beer.
Yeah, exactly. And you can see here at the Whitney, we had fun, and also Carlos does too, hanging some of these paired paintings, not side by side, as you might often see them like in an art history slideshow or on the wall, but in corners at 90-degree angles. And that was really meant to suggest something kind of uncanny about this mirroring or doubling, that you could imagine like opening a medicine cabinet or looking at a reflection in a mirror as you drive on the road. And so you see in the distance here, actually a large painting and a small painting of the same motif, and closer in a kind of sculptural object, and then its kind of mirror complement in drawing. And we put in both places some mirrors, which I think was a debate. It was a brilliant idea of our design team at the Whitney. Melody and Jerry should have a shout out, but there was a lot of perseverating. Was it too Vegas or razzle dazzle? And I think we each found a little touch of that, kind of brought the idea home and kind of animated the whole sense of Jasper's mind being a place where these collisions and doubles take place. And
one interesting thing, Anne, is that you see basically in the slide the catenary painting. That's a sort of, it's a catenary drawing, as a matter of fact. I mean, it's a drawing where you see a dot in the center, a brilliant dot, and that dot is actually a mirror. And
yeah.
Being asked about how Jasper participated in this process, and the one thing to say is that he made some at times some very precise indications, and I do remember that he asked me when we were talking about the show if this specific work was part of the checklist. So there were works that I felt that he wanted to make sure that were, although he gave us, an enormous amount of freedom to devise the curatorial apparatus, but he makes sure at specific moments that certain works that obviously are key for him would be included. Yeah, but to put that in context, I would say, Carlos, that was probably fewer than 10, maybe out of 500 objects. It was so specific when he mentioned something like that. Right. And to speak to that idea of freedom and Jasper's involvement, a number of people have asked about that. He was this incredible abiding presence in the process and so supportive. He's the single biggest lender to the show. And Carlos and I would go see him in Sharon maybe every 3 or 4 months. And often Carlos would spend the night and I'd show up and we'd have lunch. We'd see what he's working on in the studio. We'd ask questions. We pulled things out of the archive. But he really observed this kind of very respectful division between the kind of professional capacities of the artist and the curator. And the artist makes the work and the curator makes the show. And so he was on the one hand extremely involved and on the other hand, not so much involved. And that was, I think, so liberating for us to have that sense of his trust and curiosity about what we would do, but at the same time, not so much direction, which sometimes could be unnerving because you're like, oh, I wonder if I'm getting it right, or what does Jasper think? And you just have to kind of go with it. Get over that.
Let's go to the next slide. One of the many contradictions or even oxymorons that seem to come out of Johns's work is what you take as the title of another section, unique prints. And prints obviously are, defined by the fact that they're multiples, that they're not like a single painting or drawing, but they're an addition of 10 or 20 or 100. But in fact, Johns makes unique prints, and you seized on that as something really interesting. But why don't you tell us all what that means really?
It's like everything is unique and everything is part of a series in the work, right? And prints are like a very favorite playground of his, because he really pushes the boundaries of the medium to make it express something that the medium initially is not set up to. He has kept this is one of the most beautiful poems. It's a favorite of mine, and I think it's extraordinary because the works are so incredibly beautiful. But they, again, he has used the technique of prints and then make additions on top of the prints so that it makes it, unrepeatable.
My shades are on a timer, apparently. I'm not doing this for special effects.
But it's very dramatic, Scott.
Sorry, I think they're going up all across the office. I apologize.
The other thing to say, Anne, is that usually the print requires a series of intermediate process in order to be completed. And most artists don't keep those intermediate processes. I mean, they usually, the master printer notes them down so they can be repeated, but ultimately it is the final print that is kept. In the case of Jasper, very early on, he started keeping those intermediate steps, but not only keeping them, but signing. Right? And so one can use the term archival prints and say that he has kept all his archival prints. Some of those are simply trial proofs in which he's trying different colors or different combinations of form. Yeah. On some of them he works, and they are working proofs. And they constitute an amazing body of work in itself. And it's very revelatory in terms of his relationship to process and the notion of when
we can go to the next slide. Sorry to interrupt. Yeah.
Yeah. When a work is finished and unfinished. All of this, in this group, for example, two prints, the very colorful prints that are at the top left and at the bottom right are final prints, are considered final works. Everything else are, in between process. They're basically the archival prints. This is part of an extraordinary body of work. This is just a tiny sample of everything he has experimented with in terms of this entitled Red, Yellow, Blue. And the final print that is connected to those working proofs doesn't look anything like any of this. So you see him at play as at its most experimental, his wild use of color, and that's something that Scott and I both were absolutely mesmerized and wanted to bring to the exhibition.
Yeah, and Carlos, I mean, you said it so well. I think maybe the one thing I would add that would be interesting is that even when taking an idea like the unique prints, which is already that I hadn't really thought about it, Anne, as you put it, kind of an oxymoron or something, that we would then, as we did everywhere, take two different looks at that. So at the Whitney, you have monotypes from one series. This kind
so
of
we can pop the slide back again.
Yeah, if you go back. And then in Philadelphia, you have the working and trial proofs that Carlos mentioned. So in either place, you would get a look at unique prints, but you would get a different idea of what that might mean in Jasper's work. And, this kind of, I think, points to what was both, you had to be kind of tough on yourself when you were curating the show to pull out the idea. Because of course the tendency might be in the unique prints gallery to have a few monotypes, a few working proofs, a few trial proofs, maybe a few different motifs. But we thought, well, if the idea is really going to come forward, you had to be so rigorous and leave a lot by the side of the road, or in the catalog raising of prints, or in the storeroom, and try to get inside Jasper's head. Like if we were going to show this experimentation with color and kind of playing with an image in different ways, really focusing on a single image and a matrix would allow you to see that. And, you know, we were so struck in his studio and also in Washington, DC, where there this incredible archive of this material, this almost cinematic quality as you pulled the proofs one to the next. Like if you think of different images in a film strip that you unfurl where maybe the color changes a little bit, but the image feels almost the same. And that's kind of what led to the way that we displayed the works at the Whitney in this dark room with this kind of glowing, unfurling quality. It actually goes all around the room. So you're surrounded by these Savarin monotypes. And then in Philadelphia, thinking of like filling a wall and seeing that same image articulated through these different colors, in pale colors, bright colors, dark colors, but just the kind of breadth and the imagination and the kind of almost mural-like quality. We really wanted to make these rooms as we installed them feel, you know, as alive and as fresh and as illuminating of the ideas that we saw in the work as we could make them without hopefully taking too heavy a hand where it felt like, you know, we were over editorializing or being too authorial. And there was always that kind of back and forth between us as to how to find that balance.
Yeah. I mean, the digging into the trials and working proofs in such a show like this, where you are having to say no, in fact, to so many hundreds and hundreds of things, you know, for me was a very striking statement. And it matched very, very honestly to perhaps the unexpected for many people giant role that prints and drawings take in Johns's career, from the beginning right through to today. The amount of time and thought that he would give to like a little drawing, or as you say, the umpteenth iteration of a certain print, you know, there that commitment is there just as much as to some oil on canvas painting that commands a whole wall, for example. And I think that what comes through in both shows is not only that commitment throughout the exhibitions from beginning to end, but if you go back to the former slide also, what you end up getting here in a very pointed way, but throughout the show in general, is that conversation between the works on paper and the painting and sculpture. And you might just tell people for a moment, Scott, how the prints and the bronze Savarin can actually play with each other.
Sure, yeah, you can, it's a little hard to tell in this slide, but that bronze, painted bronze, also like the Elkans at the center of the room, is dead center in the room. And all of the prints are circling it. And they're made, you know, 20 years apart, a couple of decades, from the early 60s to the 80s. And it's almost, when I'm in that room, I feel like this Savarin can has imagined these later proliferations of this image, which, you know, he's used again and again. So they're kind of like growing out of this brain at the center of the room. Maybe I'm getting a little too sci-fi, but it kind of feels like the right idea for me because of Jasper's endless kind of recursive relationship to some of his most signature motifs. And, you know, I think what you also said that really resonates for me, and the way that Carlos and I talked about the show, was we were insisting from the very beginning in a non-hierarchical relationship between the work on paper and the paintings. And that felt super important to us because we see that as a key idea in Jasper's own art. He's made many thousands more works on paper than paintings. I don't think he maybe brings to those mediums the same levels of value that maybe the market or some curators do. And we were not going to put, I mean, these are rooms of print primarily, but in general, you have work on paper in almost every room of the exhibition. They're not side galleries. Yeah. And, you know, that just felt like something we hadn't really seen to this degree, maybe in a big Jasper Johns show. And it's kind of uncommon even in a retrospective of most artists that are so well known for their paintings. And that also took a lot of, you know, willpower to not always reach for the painting that you could put on the wall, that's like what people would look for, you know, to start a checklist, not with, these are the 200 greatest Jasper Johns paintings that everyone's going to want to see, but to start with, what are the ideas we're trying to illustrate, the feelings we're trying to evoke, and then what works do we marshal to tell that story?
And it's interesting what kind of what kind of stories you do not tell by not including the works. You know, if you privilege, you know, painting and sculpture, what are the things that you're not saying about Jasper? And what are the things that appear once you include those? And it was evident to us that it was a whole different world of imagination, really.
Yeah. I think it's one of the things that makes the exhibition a very 2020s show, right? Because I think across the board, curators are waking up to the realization that these kind of institutionalized mediums, they're not separated like that in the artist's practice. And so why did museums come along and kind of enforce presenting them as separate? And so it feels very today to me. I mean, you both mentioned often, like, oh my God, you know, there've been so many Jasper Johns shows over the decades. Inevitably, this one feels like today because it's made today, but also in certain ways, and I think this is a strong one, it very much reflects a kind of curatorial point of view of this moment in time that feels very honest in relation to the artist's work in a great way to me.
Thank you.
But let's go on. Next slide. Right. So now we have two opposing kind of portrayals in the two cities in this section called Reveries. And I think you see it right off the bat, actually, when you look through these slides, but I mean, because you have the names on them. But here we are in New York with Dreams. And we're going to go on to Philadelphia to Nightmares 2 slides later. But Dreams and Nightmares, of course, is very provocative, but not self-evident in the same kind of way as some of your other themes. So I'd be interested to hear you both talk about how you landed on that division. And this body of work that is encompassed in them is kind of mid-career for Johns, and what was going on there in your minds. Maybe go back to the first slide in the group again.
I mean, Scott, before you go, and you should take it from here, but I just wanted to say that one thing that was very important in our conversations was how attuned Scott was to the emotional temperature of the work, you know, because of course, Jasper is an extremely, I mean, we can describe him as a rationalist, and in many ways he might be, but there's also a profound ground of emotion. And Scott was immediately attuned to that. And I think these two rooms are a great example of that, because when we were thinking about how to talk about this later period, this mid-career phase, Scott felt, you know, that it truly had to do with emotional temperature, that we had to address the emotional temperature of the work.
Yeah, Carlos, I think that's true. You know, in the 80s and 90s, there's this opening up of the work to so many different kinds of images, from Jasper's own life, from art history, memories of his step-grandmother, or of a Picasso painting he liked, or of symbols that he didn't, you know, even tell you what they were, and images from the Eisenheim altarpiece. And often the discussion, or the way you show them, is you sort the work by its iconography, and you kind of imagine that if you can decode all these symbols, you'll then know what the work means. And at some point in the process, you know, when Carlos and I are going back and forth, there came this idea, you know, what if we took the same iconography in both places and sorted it not according to what the image was, but according to the palette and that emotional temperature that Carlos was saying. And you could see an image turn kind of surreal and dreamy and beautiful and light, or something rather dark and almost scary, you know. And you saw the cast arm in Perilous Night, and you see it right here in the painting studio on the left. And it felt like in all the galleries in the show, not just these, you had to kind of feel them in your gut when you walked in the room. You had to kind of understand what the gallery was about without maybe reading the wall text, that there was going to be a conversation among the works that just felt sort of viscerally present in the atmosphere and the temperature. And this, I think, was probably the most that we tried to push that feeling, or those two feelings, by sorting the work of the same period and the same iconography in these sort of dissimilar ways.
And
Yeah,
there
we
is-
can skip forwards to slide. Look at the arm in the studio on the left. And now you see there are three of them.
That's the back one, yeah.
Right.
With skull and crossbones and the sense of danger.
Yep.
It's
Yep.
also, a sort of, there's been, especially in this period, so much soul searching about the meaning of these words and of these elements that Jasper used, and
Like a detective.
like a very sort of eccentric detective, and it's almost like I think, Anne, it's like a Duchampian specialist. I mean, this work has produced a lot of Johnson specialists, right? And as much as we feel that it is useful to point out that the original context, the viewer needs to keep in mind that the meaning keeps changing in Johns. The meaning of the motifs keeps changing because the motifs keep being used and reused in different contexts. And that speaks to the kaleidoscopic nature of the work. It's really like a kaleidoscope, in which every combination, every turn brings you a different combinations of forms and colors, but different meanings as well. And for us, it was much more important to focus on the process of the kaleidoscope rather on the trying to fix the meaning. It's not for us about that. It's not possible. True.
It's the fluidity. Yeah.
Yes. And some people were telling me, well, in Philadelphia, it's so dark. We have the nightmares. And besides that, it's one of my favorite rooms in the show. I was saying, well, the nightmares are very dreamy in a way that the dreams are so they look as opposite, but I think that they speak to the same sort of emotion, and it's a feeling of deep instability and anxiety for sure.
And I think when you do it right, we have to each be slightly jealous of the other room that's in the other place. And I have to say, I walked in and Carlos installed this room so beautifully. I was like, oh my God, the nightmares. That's really just so killer. You felt it instantly. And this kind of incredible, just not just the palette, but the imagery, they're always all coming together. Sometimes these works have been discussed in relation to the AIDS crisis in the 80s and, which of course is ongoing, but the devastation in the creative community, and there's been links to some of the images that Jasper used of suffering creatures, let's say from the Eisenheim altarpiece. And in this gallery, I felt that sense of loss and kind of mortal peril in a way that I had never felt before from these very same paintings.
And again, many of these choices were sculpts. So that speaks to the curatorial process. I think we're jealous of ourselves.
Very good. It's a good place to be. But I also think from what you're saying, what it's saying to me is you a little bit wanted to go against the grain of academic interpretation of Johns, which is so much about the brain and the head of this artist, and say that feeling as much as thinking, or feeling can't be divorced from thinking, is what needs to also come into play when people think about or look at and take in these works.
Interpretation, what is proper to interpretation is to freeze things, right? And then these frozen things accumulate and create this strata. And then, it's very difficult for a younger audience or somebody who maybe is not young, but wants to look freshly at the work to do that, because there's all this strata. And we did want it, with the utmost respect for those colors, we did want them to blow all them up.
With utmost respect.
Yeah, in a nice
very
way,
lucky.
as a loving gesture, just to allow, some air to come in and some people to look at these things anew.
Yeah, one of the great privileges or luck of coming after the incredible research that went into the catalog raisonné of paintings by Roberta Bernstein and of the drawings, and even looking back to the MoMA catalog that's now 25 years old, where people spent so much time and thought putting all the pieces in the right order. That also allowed us a kind of freedom, because we knew we didn't have to make a show that felt like the so-called definitive Jasper Johns show, whatever that might be, that we could take a different tack, that we could, Carlos is always talking about the fragment and the whole in Jasper's work, that we could, I don't want to say we didn't blow it up, but that there was a a space now to shake things up and be a little irreverent because of all the work that we were following. It's not to contradict that work. It's just that there was this freedom. We didn't have the responsibility of doing the first big retrospective. And we didn't have to feel like it was the last. Maybe new ideas will come out of this show, we hope, and the book. And people will just take different fragments and run with them.
Yes, it's not a show made as a definitive show. It's a show made as sort of a permanently unfinished project.
Yeah. Very much in the spirit of. So we're going to go to 2 last slides because a lot of questions I see are mounting up from all the listeners, viewers.
You can be fast on the end then.
We'll be really fast on the end, which is recent work, very straightforward section that you did in both cities' elegies in light in Philadelphia. And then the next slide, elegies in dark at the Whitney. Dark, but with humor, I would say. But I would just really love to ask you one quick question about the whole idea of working on this project over a number of years as you're watching the artist make new work at the same time, and how exhilarating it would have, I imagine, been for you to see that the work that Johns was continuing to make as you were working on this show was so tremendous and so surprising.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great example right here. And, we've worked on the show for 5.5 years, which is kind of crazy to even say out loud. And it was supposed to be 4.5, but then the pandemic gave us an extra year. And the 2 paintings you're looking at on the right here were from 2018. So they did not exist at the time we started the project. And that sense of showing up at the studio of this artist in his late 80s and seeing him exploring so many new ideas. And, this elegies term is because so many of the works do feel like they're reflecting on mortality. They show figures in grief and despair, or something like a skeleton, and in a kind of extremely brave way. And it's such a rare opportunity to find an artist at this late stage in his life reflecting on being at that late stage in his life. That's different from the late Ellsworth Kelly or Alex Katz, let's say. Someone mentioned Joan Jonas to me the other day, which I think is a really good parallel, or certainly Picasso did. But Carlos was always really good at reminding me that even in this sense of mortality and grief, there was always that jocularity that you see, or some aliveness and the curiosity that Jasper was bringing to his studio.
Yeah.
And the fact that it's exactly as you said, Dan. I mean, the new work is amazing, and I think that one of the things that make it amazing is that it's so clear in terms of what his intentions are. It's almost like he's making manifesto after manifesto, right? It's almost like this confrontation maybe with with his own age, make it so that each of the works is a very clear statement of what the poetics are, and that makes every new work very powerful.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask a question from the audience. Somebody who wants to know, after having done all this work for all these years, after having done the installation, seen the show in 2 cities, what surprised you? What did you learn that you hadn't known you would learn? Hard question to just sort of answer off the tops of your heads, I bet.
Many things, many.
Too many things.
Constant surprises, I mean, when we were first look at the catalog of drawings, that was like, wow, we had so many wow moments, and just pulling out things from the studio, going to the National Gallery for independently, but exchanging, crazy messages about what we were seeing. I mean, I think that there were so many moments, and that we really learned a lot about the work. I mean, so much.
Yeah, and I think you have to kind of allow yourself to be surprised. It's interesting, as a historian, you often smooth out the differences in the story of an artist's life and work. You try to look for how one thing anticipates the other, and there's a kind of continuity to a narrative. And when you really look at Jasper's work and you imagine like you're a Martian and you come down and you see a flag and you see corpse and mirror and you see one of those skeletons, you wouldn't necessarily know that the same artist had made all those things. I mean, it's almost like you have to have this incredible suspension, a willing suspension of, belief to hold all this as a thought. And that was something maybe that the cover of the catalog sort of captures for us, all those different images. So for me, the surprise was to allow myself to kind of reckon with the incredible diversity of this project that is this career, the protean nature of his mind, and not try to make it make sense with a through line, but to kind of relish those jangles and incongruities in the work.
Yeah. I think I'm going to finish with the request to explain how you came to the title. Curators always torture themselves over coming up with a title for the show, also because then you have to deal with other people in the museum who have opinions as well. I won't go into that. But so,
yeah. On.
And again, it was the same kind of process. We had an initial suggestion, a counter suggestion, lots of conversations, and then we came to something that we both liked. And that describes the entire curatorial process. It was an initial suggestion, a counter suggestion, lots of discussions. I said that we have passionate agreements and dispassionate disagreements. And the title was just an example of that. Now, the title speaks about the structure of the show, as well as to the content of the show. And to this, intention, very maybe naive, but certainly very, very deep, to try to make it so that the show allows a little tour into Jasper's mind.
Yeah, and I think we think of it in these two ways, that there's the mirroring of the show, and then as Carlos said, the tour into Jasper's mind. It is that each of the 10 galleries or pairs of galleries are maybe thinking about a different turn of mind, if you will, a kind of reflection on that, whether it's how he works with a certain process, or how he explores a certain emotion, or how a place affects him. And so maybe the show is 10 or 20, depending on how you want to count, reflections on this mind that is Jasper Johns, and to some degree also on that of the viewer, because the work is so much an invitation for your own engagement, perceptually, emotionally. And so we sort of thought of Mind Mirror working in a number of different ways.
And does one of you have the catalog at hand to show to the viewers exactly what you're talking about? There you go.
And we can show you one little secret thing in this catalog just to end.
Perfect.
We said we would go see Jasper all the time, and he very rarely made suggestions. But one idea that he had quite specifically, the catalog has this really cool dust jacket, and we should do a shout out to Scott Williams, our designer, who put up with us. And he had the idea that we could emboss on the front of the cover, which you can't see, unfortunately, because it's blind embossed white, but you can see it on the back, this image of what Jasper calls the painter, the stick figure, the artist rather. And it was Jasper's suggestion, we didn't know what to put on the cover, that he wanted this image in white on one side and black on the other. And that was his contribution to the design of the book.
And he might be saying hello, or he might be saying goodbye, or maybe both.
Fantastic. Great way to end the evening. Thank you both so very much. And thanks to everybody who was with us listening and watching. Have a good night. Thank you.